Today was the first day with students back on campus at my school, and so a new year has begun and summer has officially come to a close. As an English teacher, I spent a lot of my time this summer reading, and I wanted to give you a sense of what a high school English teacher reads in the summer. I try and look for two different things out of my reading in the summer. One is just entertainment. It's nice to sort of kick back, relax, and just read what I want to read just for fun. The other is to keep thinking. I always want to think about new ideas, new things to do in the classroom, new conversations to have. So I want my books to be page turners, and I want my books to give me what Jimmy Neutron called a brain blast. So as I go through each of these books, I have given each of them a score, the page turner score and the brain blaster score. Some books cater more towards one, some books cater more towards the other. Some books did great at both. One of the first books I read this summer was Sourdough by Robin Sloan. This was on recommendation from my wife. It's one of her recent favorites. I will admit, magical realism is not a genre I spend a lot of time reading, and so it wasn't sort of like right in my wheelhouse. Given that, I've given this a page turner score of a B because I found it sometimes a little bit hard to get through. It wasn't, boring by any means. I did really enjoy all of the baking and the nerding out. It reminded me quite a lot about the HBO show Silicon Valley. In terms of its sort of critiques of sort of tech bro culture and the way that that interacts with the sort of like very homey, slow process of baking. I really did like the narration style. The main character had a real sort of like vigor to her narration that I really appreciated. And so I've given this a brain blaster score of a B+. It definitely didn't like make me think new thoughts about anything, but I really appreciated thinking about sort of Silicon Valley and the way that, again, like our culture is sort of shifting its norms around both technology and food, and the way that those can intersect, and the ways that those can intersect in cool ways, and the ways that those can intersect in kind of weird ways. I read Annie Bot by Sierra Greer. I'm back home, so I have the physical book with me. And you can see I did a whole video about this earlier in the summer. It really surprised me. I didn't expect to like it as much as I did. I read it fairly quickly because I was really intrigued by the new ideas in it. So I've given this a page turner score of an A-. I did find it really entertaining, and I found myself like wanting to sit back down and read the next section and sort of get to the end. I did have some interesting thoughts about it. They weren't sort of the most profound, like I'm thinking about AI and robotics much differently than I was, before I read it, but I definitely, found myself pondering new ideas. And so as such, I've also given it an A- as a brain blaster score. So overall, this was a great surprise. Again, I didn't expect to like it as much as I did. The books that consumed the most of my time this summer was the Skyward series by Brandon Sanderson. So this book contains 4 main novels and then 3 novellas that are sort of in between, that follow side characters in between the sort of events of the main series. Gotta say, I have been a huge Brandon Sanderson fan, and I continue to be a huge Brandon Sanderson fan. And this book, even though it was sort of marketed as YA, definitely still got all of the great things that I love about Brandon Sanderson. The really likable characters, the fast-paced plot, the intriguing world building with like really cool, societies and technologies and magic systems and those sorts of things. The first moment in the first book when Spin sort of takes Mbot for a ride, her rocket ship, the way that that scene was written felt almost identical to a classic sort of like Boy and His Dragon story. Aragon, the first time he sort of successfully rides a dragon, or How to Train a Dragon, any of those stories, like the trope of like person bonding with this thing that she will befriend and ride on into combat. The tropes were very, very similar and very well done. And so I think, fantasy and sci-fi draw off of a lot of the same sort of internal things that we all love in stories. And this series was fantastic at that. In terms of the arc of the series, I will say, I think the novellas were actually my favorite, if I'm counting them sort of as one book, because I really liked what he did with, he and a co-writer did with some of the side characters and giving us some of their perspective. For me, the more contained early books where it's just sort of like the simple world that the main character is sort of like beginning to learn about, is always for me more fascinating than the like gigantic world by the end of a series. So in terms of a page turner score, this is a far and away A+. I couldn't get the books from the library fast enough. The final book, despite it probably being my least favorite of all the books, I read in one day. I stayed up till 1 a.m. and did the classic stay up all night to finish the book because you just can't put it down. In terms of Brain Blaster score, again, I didn't go in thinking about these as like super serious intellectual books that were gonna, you know, make me think new thoughts. And it didn't do that a ton. It wasn't obviously like super dull and like I got stupider as I read them. But as such, you know, I'm giving this a C+. I didn't really find myself thinking that much. I found myself just like reading and engaging and being thrilled. Perhaps the biggest surprise of the summer was a book by Ray Naylor called The Mountain and the Sea. Boy, was I blown away. I think that this book does such a brilliant job of exploring alien intelligence in a really unique way, right? Like it's not actually about aliens who come from another planet to Earth and then we have to learn to communicate. It's about another species on Earth, octopi, that sort of have developed intelligence that is just so different from the way humans think. If you're a fan of the movie Arrival or of Ted Chiang's short story that is based on stories of your life, I think you will love this book. And I think this book did a really great job, maybe even a better job because it's longer and is able to get into more detail at sort of exploring what it would mean to encounter a consciousness or an intelligence that is so absolutely foreign and quite frankly alien to the human experience. And so for Brain Blaster score, this was an A+. Like I found myself like really thinking really hard as I was reading and like learning new things and really changing my perspective on a lot of things. And I was just, you know, absolutely thrilled at that. In terms of page turning, it was a little bit slower because I found myself thinking so much. It's not a very sort of action heavy book. And so it took me longer to get through it. And I will also note, I think my one complaint about the book is that the ending felt rushed to me. There were a few different storylines that felt like they were gonna weave together, and then only in the last like 2 pages did they finally come together, and then it didn't feel fully resolved. Actually, as soon as I put the book down, I had to Google like Mountain and the Sea sequel ? I really couldn't tell by the end. Is this meant to be standalone or is this ending trying to sort of foreshadow a sequel? And I personally don't think it landed as well as it could have. And so given all of that, I have given this a page turner score of a B because it was slower to get through. And I think the pacing was strange at times, but still obviously a Brain Blaster score of an A+. Still makes this one of the best books that I read this summer. Another book that I picked up but didn't know what to expect from was Jesmyn Ward's newest book, Let Us Descend. So if you saw my earlier video reacting to the New York Times' most recent top 100 books of the 21st century so far list, Jesmyn Ward, I believe, was on the list 3 times. I think she was the most popular author, or the author whose books most showed up on that list. And so quite clearly for the New York Times and the authors who obviously participated in that survey, she's one of the sort of up and coming authors of the century so far. And so I was really intrigued to read one of her books. And I originally picked this one up because I read a New York Times review of it that compared it to Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno is one of my favorite books. I'm such a huge fan. I've taught it before, and I was really intrigued by that. The title, Let Us Descend, is a line from Inferno, and I was really curious to sort of see how Jesmyn Ward was gonna take a sort of tale of slavery in, you know, pre-Civil War America and sort of weave Dante into it. I will say I was a little bit disappointed, and I feel bad because I think I was disappointed because I went in with the wrong expectations. I think that article misled me, and I found myself trying as I read to constantly compare it to Dante. I don't actually really think the entire plot structure of the book was inspired by Dante's Inferno. There were definitely moments, or Dante's Inferno was mentioned from time to time, and you can see like general sort of like thematic inspiration at times, but at its core, it's a story about sort of a slave who is trying to sort of escape and make a life for herself and discover meaning in the world, which is what many good books are about. And so I think that review sort of corrupted me, where I was looking too much for Dantean comparisons. I thus wasn't able to sort of appreciate the book on its own merits. The thing that I do really appreciate, and that I will be curious if I do read more Jesmyn Ward, her prose is really forceful and vigorous. So as a page turner score, I'm giving this one a C+. I didn't find myself like gripped in like wanting to keep reading and wanting to keep finding out. I did finish it. It definitely wasn't, you know, like an awful book by any means. I didn't DNF it, but I didn't, again, like find myself pulled into it. And so as a Brain Blaster score, I'm giving it a B. And I think my enjoyment of it was really clouded by my expectations from this New York Times article, really comparing it to Dante. Another book that I read this summer was none other than The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This was a book that I actually didn't read this physical copy. I read an online version that was AI assisted. Earlier this summer, I made a video reacting to the launch of this new AI startup called Rebind, where they take classic books and they sort of create AI companions based on interviews with experts about the book to sort of help new readers to the classics understand the books better. And I signed up as a beta tester, and so I read The Great Gatsby again with sort of AI commentary and a chatbot to sort of ask questions to. My next video is going to be a recap of that whole experience. At its core, I got to read The Great Gatsby again, which is always a joy. It's definitely a favorite classic book of mine, and I'll never begrudge an opportunity to reread this wonderful book. So I'm giving this a page turner score of a C+, but that is particular to this summer's reading using Rebind. In terms of a Brain Blaster score, I'm giving this one an A-. This is not, I think, representative of The Great Gatsby as a whole, but again, more particular to this reading. Because I've read this book so many times, I feel like I have sort of most of my thoughts pretty solidified on The Great Gatsby, and so it didn't sort of teach me anything new about The Great Gatsby, but the thoughts that I did have were more about AI and teaching and those sorts of things, which again, I'll share in my next videos. The last book in this section is Memorial, a version of Homer's Iliad by Alice Oswald. It's a very small book, so I have given this a B+ on the page turner scale. Very fast to get through. It is poetry, so it's not a lot of words on a page, and so it reads very fast. I really love the Iliad. I love Homer's prose. I felt this was a cool concept where it essentially takes only the deaths, only the characters' deaths, and sort of presents this poem as an elegy or as lamentations for those characters who die and who are often glossed over in the sort of just like battle sequences in the Iliad. But I do think the Iliad is just better. I feel bad saying that, but not really. You're not gonna redo the Iliad better than the Iliad. And so if you really like the Iliad, just go reread that. For me, this gets a Brain Blaster score of a B because it still feels Greek, it still feels like Homer. If you really like the Iliad, just go reread the Iliad. The next category of books that I read were books for school. All of these books have something to do with my job in some way or another. So the first of these was Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. At the beginning of the summer, I had thought maybe I'll teach this in my English 10 class, and I read the book and I can go ahead and say I'm definitely gonna teach it this year. I've never read it with students before, but I absolutely loved it, both in terms of the page turnability. It gets an A in that regard. I thought it was thrilling and gripping and exciting, and it did a really good job of making dinosaurs scary, but it also satisfied in the Brain Blaster category. I found myself having really interesting thoughts about the limits of science and the peril of ambition and the ways in which sort of ambition can corrupt us. It gets an A in both categories. It was a page turner and an A Brain Blaster. I'm planning on teaching this book right after we read Frankenstein because I think that it will be a really, really interesting comparison. Next is a collection of short stories called The Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. Partway through the summer, I found out that I was going to be teaching a class that I've never taught before. At least to an extent, I have to teach some of the books that the previous teacher taught last year because she had already sort of made plans for that. And so this was a book that the teacher who taught this class previous to me has taught. I sort of went in a little bit skeptical, but I was again really, really pleased and really surprised by the way that the short stories in this really do interpret maladies. This book at its core is trying to explore different ways that people can be sad and that people can suffer and that people can grieve and that people can struggle. And it makes all of the characters in each of the story feel so real and so deeply complex in such a short amount of time. Like each of the stories is, 10, 15 pages each. And I found myself like really loving and feeling for the characters and mourning and grieving or celebrating along with them. Because of that, and because the nature of short stories, I'm giving this a page turner score of an A-. I found myself, reading it fairly quickly, and I found it really easy to get through. And I'm also giving this a Brain Blaster score of an A. I really found myself amazed at the depth of emotion that Junpo Hiri is able to sort of convey in her characters, again, in fairly short amounts of time. The final fiction text in this category is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This was, I believe, number 9 on the New York Times' top 100 books of the 21st century, and another one that the teacher who taught the class I'm about to teach prior has done in the past. And so I read it this summer and I'm gonna teach it, and I have to say, I don't think I got it. I don't think it clicked with me, but I did get the sense that there is something that could click and will click and I want to click, because it was one of those books where I could sense that there was more that I wasn't getting. Part of this was because I strong-armed my book club into reading it with me, and then I procrastinated and I read the whole book in one day, and that was probably not the best way to read this book. In terms of a page turner score, I'm gonna give it a B-, despite the fact that I read this in 12 hours, I think, because I think that this book really deserves slowness. I'm really excited to read it with students, to really sort of dive into it and read it slowly, because I think there's a lot between the lines, and I didn't pick up on that my first time, but I picked up on the sense that there is more that I wasn't getting. So given that, I'm giving this a Brain Blaster score of an A-, because again, it's not an A or an A+, because again, it didn't fully click. I don't fully get the point in the message and the sort of richness of it, but I got enough to like have a sense that it's there, and to be convinced that like I can find it and my students and I can find it together. I did also get to read some nonfiction. The first of these books was Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. So I have thought about and taught about Joseph Campbell many times, basically since my first year teaching, but I've never actually read his book. And here's what I'll say, I didn't read the whole thing because I don't actually think he's that good of a writer. There, I said it. I think his ideas are brilliant. I think some interviews I've seen him give are fantastic, but in terms of the actual writing, I found it pretty hard to get through. I think the nature of his project lends itself to a kind of writing that is really hard to do well, because he's trying to make so many diverse connections and basically prove that myths and stories from around the world and around time all share common themes. And what ends up happening is that his prose, especially in the bulky sections in the middle where he's sort of outlining each step of the hero's journey, become these sort of bloated and erudite connection jumbles where he's trying to like tell 3 different stories at the same time and like not actually say what he means, but just sort of like create these sort of like matrices of connections between all these myths. And I found it, hard to get through. I found myself skimming great portions of the middle. I think some of his introductory material and some of his conclusions at the end were very good, but I think in many ways the summaries of the hero's journey that you get in most places are very good, and I actually don't think it's worth the time to read every single word that he's written in this book. There, I said it. So I'm gonna give this a page turner score of a D+. In terms of Brain Blaster ideas, I'm giving this a C. I think it's much higher if you're not familiar with Joseph Campbell's work at all and you read like the introduction. I think it would be fantastic, but I'm pretty familiar with the sort of general scope of his ideas, and so I don't think this book taught me anything really new that I didn't already know about Joseph Campbell's thoughts, and so for me it wasn't that groundbreaking or brain blasting in any way. Moving away from literary theory and into more proper philosophy, I read The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, and my reactions are fairly similar to my reactions with Joseph Campbell's work. I found Camus' prose through the bulky sections of this book to be terse. He's trying to like create these gigantic philosophical matrices of ideas and then hold them all together at once. And I personally don't think he does enough of a job of like being really clear about what he means. Part of this might be that this book is in translation, and so it might be the fault of the translator to some extent. But the one redeeming factor of this book is the very end, the section that's actually called The Myth of Sisyphus. So there's like a famous essay called The Myth of Sisyphus that is only the last couple pages. And if I had just read this, I would have loved it. All of this beginning stuff, not great. But The Myth of Sisyphus itself, this essay was fantastic. The way he sort of told the story of Sisyphus with an eye to his sort of absurdist philosophy, I think is a great encapsulation of Camus' philosophy. And it was entertaining, and it was easy to read, and it was profound, and it was beautifully written. And so I'm giving this a page turner score of a C+, because I wish I had turned all these pages and just read this last section. I'm giving it a little bit higher on the Brain Blaster score itself as a B- because I've never read any of Camus' philosophy before, and so there was some sort of new stuff. I was familiar with the kind of general idea of his kind of absurdism, but again, I did like a decent amount of this last section that like was a really good encapsulation and crystallization of what he means by, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, which is sort of the famous line that I think many people know. And yeah, so there's some value there, but the book as a whole, I didn't find that groundbreaking or profound for me personally. And the last book in this category and in this list as a whole is The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious by Carl Jung. So this was not a book that Jung himself published. This is a series of essays and speeches and lectures that he wrote and gave throughout his career that editors have sort of compiled into this. And so also as such, I did not read this entire book. The essays that I read were fairly good. This one of the sort of 3 philosophy books I read was the best. I think he's the best writer. He's fairly direct and says what he means. I think he says what he means fairly bluntly, and I have some pretty strong disagreements with him sort of personally, but I think I was able to read this and to get a really clear sense of what he means and what he thinks without ever having read his stuff before. It is still, however, slow going. Like I was annotating and writing notes in the margins and like thinking, so it wasn't a page turner by any means. I'm giving it a C there. I was interested, I wanted to learn more, but it was still slow, and that's not a fault of that. I don't think every book needs to be a page turner. You need to, read it in one sitting. This was definitely a book where I would read 5 or 10 pages at a time, take a break, do other stuff, come back to it, because I wanted to think about it, and it did give me a lot to think about. As such, I'm giving it a B+ in the Brain Blaster category, not into the A category, because again, I personally have some pretty strong disagreements with many of the things he's saying, and so I feel, this is my list, I get to give it the grade I want, so he doesn't get an A because I think he's wrong. I'm really excited to get back into the school year though now and to read with students, and so my personal reading will slow down as the school year goes, but I will keep you posted on all the thoughts that I'm having, and I'm hoping that having this YouTube channel will keep me motivated to read more, not just for school. And so if you could give this a like and a subscribe, the better this channel does, the more motivated I will be to keep reading, not just what I'm reading with students, but on my own.